We're now in day 2 of NAFTA talks, the very first steps, in what's going to be a very long process. One of the core issues Canada is going to have to tackle is supply management. That's a system by which a cartel of dairy farmers enforces strict quotas and severely limits any imports. Dairy farmers say it helps control the price of dairy products. A new report from the Montreal Economic Institute, though, says it artificially inflates them. Alexandre Moreau is from the Montreal Economic Institute and the author of that report. And Graham Lloyd is the General Manager and CEO of the Dairy Farmers of Ontario. Nice to see you both.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Alexandre, I'd start with you. You guys did this report. The whole idea behind supply management is that it's meant to sort of control dairy prices. What did you guys find?
We often hear the argument that without a supply management system, the farmers, the dairy farmers and the poultry and egg as well, would not be able to compete on the world market. But again, we tend to forget that the farmers under supply management represent only 8% of all the Canadian farmers. And when we look at the 92% that are actually working on a free market, they're doing pretty well, and they are able to produce way more than the domestic level of consumption. And with the supply management system, the production is limited with the consumption in Canada, so it's limiting the possibility of growth.
Graham Lloyd, you've probably heard something like that argument before. Is there something different between dairy farmers and other kinds of farmers in Canada?
Well, first, thank you very much for having me. I think you have to start with the premise of what is happening in our dairy system. So what is happening right now within the dairy world, certainly in the Canadian market, is unprecedented growth. So I hear this notion that we don't have growth and we should be looking for export markets. But actually what's happening in the last 2.5 years or so, we've had in excess of 20% growth at the farm level. We have unprecedented demand for our products. Butter, cream, cheeses are up at record levels. And so, in fact, what's happening in Canada is we're having unprecedented now investment at the processor side. We have announced, planned, or already started about $500 million worth or $500 million worth of investment at the processor level. And that's new investment for new jobs and new growth. So the suggestion that we aren't growing or that we aren't being competitive is just it's not accurate. It doesn't reflect what's actually happening within the dairy system.
Alexandre, what did you find? I mean, there's one thing to look at the dairy farmers and the businesses that they run. What did you find about consumers, about me and what I'm paying for dairy products?
Yeah, exactly. Again, the supply management system, essentially, it's actually two essential elements. It's tariff at the barriers. We're talking about 300% tariffs, and also a system of quota that is limiting the production to the domestic level. And again, he said that the production, there was a growth in the production. Yeah, true, over the last 2 years. But if you look at the level of production that we now have, it's lower than it was in the early 1960s. So there is not many growth during the last decades. And again, he also mentioned the fact that there was a new investment in Ontario. But this plant is actually using a new class of milk that is actually criticized by not only the United States, but Australia, New Zealand, every European countries. So everyone is contesting the system of supply management system. And in the long term, eventually, not only that the milk consumption is going down per capita, but there is some type of market that we're still able to export. But those categories will eventually go down, and on the long term, there is no possibility of growth for the dairy farmers.
Mr. Lloyd, how do you respond? Are consumers sort of paying the price here?
Well, they aren't paying the price, actually. When Nielsen International Studies looked at the prices of milk, and when you compare the prices of milk and you compare apples to apples, for instance, the same type of milk in Canada and the United States, it's more expensive in the United States. I'm actually here in Washington this week. The price for a gallon of milk is listed at $4.49. So that's at least, and that's a gallon, which is less than our 4 liters. So on a price point comparison, these notions that it's more expensive in Canada, it just doesn't, it's not really accurate. And for their suggestion, actually, it's interesting to suggest that Canada should adopt an export model, which is what this report has suggested. You know, it may work in theory, but it actually doesn't work in reality. And when you look at all the other systems, there's only two systems in the world that are growing with respect to dairy, and that's actually Canada and Denmark. All the other countries that either had the system or never had it are actually failing. So I like when academics use Australia as the model. If you look what's happening in Australia right now, their government just in May of last year announced a $550 million bailout program by loans for their farms. And the reason they did that is Australia abandoned this system of supply management. And so as a result of that, they're failing farms. At the same time, their largest co-op announced a $445 million abandonment or forgivement of loans. And you look at the same thing that's happening in the United States. You have massive overproduction, and they just can't compete, and farms are going bankrupt. Today they were telling stories about last year in 2016, states like Wisconsin were losing one farm a day. That's just not happening in Canada. And the reason it's not happening is because of the system we have. And the system we have does actually match the amount of milk we need for the amount of requirements. And there isn't overproduction. And what this report that has been authored by the Montreal Economic Institute is actually advocating is for overproduction. And that's what's failing with all these other countries. And you look at the European Union. The European Union has just announced last year $1 billion with a B subsidies for their farmers because they dismantled their quota system. They have no production controls, and as a result, they need massive government subsidies. Right? That's why I turn back to what's happening here in Canada, where we do have this investment. And to say that it's an investment with something that's being challenged, it's actually not true. We have an infant formula plant that's announced they're coming to Kingston. They've announced a $220 million project. We have an announcement between Gailey and Vitalis in Winnipeg. Parmalat's just put in a massive new plant in Manitoba for fluid milk. So our system is the one that's thriving, and it's because of the Canadian dairy system.
Again, I mean, the example of Australia is quite interesting because if you look at the production level in Australia over time, even if they had a supply management system, it was only applied to commercial milk. In fact, the production was that high because they had access to the foreign markets. And when the government reduced the subsidies to the foreign export, actually the level of production went down a little bit, but actually it was based on market. And again, the supply management system, when it was abolished in Australia, what we've seen, I mean, just a few months after the transition program was done, it was a huge decrease in the price of a dairy product in Australia. So there was a benefit for the consumers that was immediately felt. And again, we're talking about subsidies for foreign farmers. Again, if you look at the statistics produced by the OECD, actually the level of subsidies that we receive here for the dairy farmers, it's not a direct subsidy. It's just that the price are kept artificially high because of the supply management system. But the support represent almost 45% of the gross revenue of dairy farmers, whereas in the United States, this support is about 10%. In Australia, it's zero. In New Zealand,
you know what,
it's
guys,
zero.
I know I sort of opened up this can of worms. We will have more of this debate, I promise, because it is clearly on the table through the NAFTA negotiations, but we do have to leave it there for today. Thanks to you both. Alexandre Moreau with the Montreal Economic Institute and Graham Lloyd, General Manager and CEO of the Dairy Farmers of Ontario.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Now, here's